I think you're describing the average voter in this country, not even an ideal leader.
Those are all Kemi Badenoch's positions. Not all of them.
Let me answer that.
Not all of them are Nigel Farage's.
Let me answer that question.
Welcome to Spectator TV, and with me is Professor Matt Goodwin. Matt has recently published a book, Bad Education, about the corruption, intellectual and moral, that's afflicting our universities. But he's perhaps best known to Spectator viewers as the author of one of the most popular Substacks at the moment, and also both the analyst and, in some respects, the advocate for national conservatism, a way of looking at our politics that puts the idea of the nation state, its citizens and its traditions at the heart of what our future should be. Matt, pleasure to have you here at The Spectator.
Thank you for making time to have the conversation. I appreciate it.
And it's great that you're here because at the moment, one of the areas that you've written about that's caused the greatest interest and for some controversy has been your gazing into the future and speculating on the basis of current trends about what Britain might look like in a generation's time. Can you outline to us what you think the demographic trends of this country are likely to prove to be and what that means for the country?
So I think at the moment we're obviously having a very vigorous debate about immigration and the post-COVID policy. But what I've tried to do with this piece of work is actually look ahead at where this country is going to be as we move towards the year 2100. So as we move towards the end of this century. And we've used a standard technique. I won't bore viewers with the detail. They can find it in the paper. But the headline finding here is if we maintain the current direction of travel in this country, then white Britons will be a minority within the UK by the year 2063. The foreign-born, people born outside of the UK and their immediate descendants will be a majority by around the year 2079. And by the end of this century, about a quarter of all people in the country will be following Islam, will be Muslim. So what I'm saying in this piece of work, in this paper, is that this country is now looks set to experience a level of demographic change, cultural change, religious change that I think is unprecedented in its history. So what I'm trying to say, even if it is a bit controversial, is look, everybody needs to just take a step back, look at the wider trends and think about, well, what does this mean for the nation state? What does it mean for our identity? What does it mean for the social contract? And what does it mean, above all, for public trust in the system? And that's why we've put this out.
And those are three specific trends there. And it's important to make clear that each of those is specific, because some people who've criticised you have said, "Oh, you're mixing up different things." So non-white, foreign-born. Boris Johnson was foreign-born. So again, when you face some of these challenges, what's your response?
So I think people get nervous when you talk about race and ethnicity for understandable reasons. But the reason you want to look at that, you want to say, okay, by 2063, white Brits will be a minority. Among the under 40s, it will be much sooner, actually. It will be closer to 2050, so only 25 years from now. That really matters because the dominant group, the dominant ethnic traditional group in a nation, is a really important point of reference, not only for that group, but also for minority groups. So, we've seen minorities in America, for example, express a lot of concern about the decline of white America because they associate that as being with the nation. If people identify as white British, we assume they're white British. Everybody ticks a box on the census. That's how we define it. The more interesting part of this for me, though, is the foreign-born and their descendants, because what that is showing us is that we are very rapidly moving into a much thinner conception of Britishness, or indeed Englishness, if you listen to the progressive class, that actually the only thing that matters in this country is arriving, signing some papers, saying you're British and therefore you are. But actually, what does it mean for this country if within 50 years, a majority of people can really only trace their roots back a generation? Many people will not even have been born in the UK, won't really have a thick sense of our history, our collective memory, our culture, our way of life. And I think that is really going to raise profound questions about how we can sustain this social contract. There's a lot of research. Robert Putnam at Harvard, for example, has shown that when nation states experience this pace of demographic change, the result is a collapse of public trust, and everybody hunkers down and they don't really know their neighbors anymore. And so the heart and soul of the nation state becomes much less healthy, if you like. And I'm concerned about the UK going down that road. We just simply experience a level of migration, of demographic change, where we don't really know who we are anymore.
Undoubtedly, the scale of change that you describe is unprecedented. People talk about Britain being a nation of migrants, and of course, we've had waves of immigration.
That's not true, of course, but anyway.
We've had waves of immigration in the past, and whether or not that's been a good thing or a bad thing, it's clear that it's never been on the scale that is happening at the moment and that we're likely to have. So I think there'd probably be a broad acceptance that the numbers of people coming, the change overall numerically, is very, very significant. Some might say, though, there's emphasis on white. Monty Palliser, Kemi Badenoch, Rishi Sunak, Kelly Holmes, Tony Sewell. None of these people are white, but they're all as British as you or me.
So I would make a distinction between British and English. And I think Britishness has always been a nationality, and Englishness has been much more about an ethnicity. And I think Englishness is different. And what is making a lot of people nervous in this country at the moment is the notion that I think they feel that we can celebrate and we can promote and we can protect every national identity and ethnicity around the world except the English identity and ethnicity. And that's making a lot of people uncomfortable. So to me, these trends really do matter. And I think they matter within the context, Michael, of a debate around mass immigration, which I think is changing very rapidly. Many of the trends that we are experiencing at the moment, we know are having profoundly negative effects on this country, I would argue. The economic case for mass migration, I think, has fallen apart when you even have the Office for Budget Responsibility saying, look, this doesn't really make sense anymore. I think the debate around the effects of migration and demographic change on crime and security, I think, is now going in a direction, the opposite direction to many people, that many people in the ruling class would have us believe. We've had freedom of information requests and so on saying, actually, yes, mass migration is driving crime. So it's a controversial thing to say, but I think the evidence is there. But I don't think people who are in the corridors of power have accepted many of these arguments, that actually, if we carry on down this road, we're going to have a whole host of negative effects. Now, one of those two, I think, is this identity question which you raise. I think many people in the ruling class are now trying to have us believe that the only thing that defines being British or English is celebrating diversity, is celebrating welcoming other people. Well, as Francis Fukuyama said, if the basis of your identity is that you welcome other people, it's also like saying you have no identity of your own. And this concerted attempt by the progressive class to reshape Britishness as being merely about the celebration of diversity, I think, is driving people into the arms of movements like Reform and so forth, because they're saying, no, actually, there is something distinctive about being British and indeed English. There is something distinctive about our identity, our history and culture. We are not just, a mishmash of liberal globalism. And that, I think, is at the root of why the West more generally is experiencing all of these political revolts.
There is so much there on the economy, on integration, on crime, on the root of what is British or English identity that I do want to explore. But one of the things that I inferred from what you said is that of the people whom I listed, you might consider that some of them would be happily acknowledged as British, but not English. So would you say that Kemi Badenoch or Rishi Sunak or Tony Sewell or Dame Kelly Holmes are not really English?
Well, this was a debate that obviously Fraser Nelson and Konstantin Kisin and among others have had. My view is Englishness is an ethnicity that is deeply rooted in a people that can trace their roots back over generations. It is a very distinctive identity and a different identity from Britishness. So I think somebody could identify as British and they can be British, but they cannot simultaneously identify as English, right? So I think that's probably a difference I have from, say, liberal progressives who say, well, anybody can be English as long as they sign a piece of paper and identify with Englishness. I actually take a much thicker view of Englishness, which is that our history, the legacy of our collective identity, the legacy of our culture, goes much further back and is deeper than simply signing some papers.
Well, I'm not English. I'm Scottish. I was born in Scotland, raised in Scotland. Superficial things. Well, maybe they're not that superficial. The football team that I would support, Scottish. So I'm definitely not English. But Rishi Sunak, born in Southampton, Southampton football fan, went to school in the most classic English way, went to Winchester, the quintessential English public school, a tea-drinking, cricket-loving family man.
Yeah, sure. No, I get the point you're making.
But he's not English.
Well, Rishi Sunak could choose to identify as English if he views himself that way. But I think it is also true that there is an English ethnicity, there is an English group that goes back over generations that Rishi Sunak would probably himself say, well, I do not have as strong a linkage to that group as other people do. And I think that's entirely acceptable to say. It's why, for example, Americans tick English on the census. There is something distinctive about that group. But there is a deeper point here, which is that the reason I think so many people in this country feel uncomfortable today is because they can sense that the ruling class is trying to impose on them a very thin sense of who we are. And again, it comes back to this idea that, no, we are very proud of our history. We have a very rich sense of who we are with an identity and a history. And we're not just going to have that whittled down into something that is just about a celebration of diversity.
How would you define English identity?
Englishness and English identity, I would say, is somebody who has been born in England, who can trace their roots back through many generations, and who would identify with a way of life and a culture that surrounds Englishness as an identity, much in the way that you say, well, how would you define somebody who's Pakistani? They would probably say, well, let's point to the same criteria. Britishness is different. Britishness has always been a state identity that has been imposed, I think, on the top, or at least has been layered over the top of our subnational identities.
But if we take pride in our traditions, what are the distinctive British and English traditions where there is a distinction? So I might take pride as a Brit, albeit a Scot, in the rule of law, in parliamentary democracy, in the role that institutions like the Royal Navy have played in safeguarding liberty, and so on.
Well, I'm sure there is Scottishness, though. There's a lot more that you'd point to than just the rules of the game. You'd point to the proud history of Enlightenment values and contribution of Scottish thinkers to culture and a distinctive Scottish way of life, I would imagine, not just the rules of the game.
And I might well say that distinctive Scottish philosophers like David Hume and Adam Smith flourished within the Union, and I might even say that Scottish regiments aren't their greatest distinction in fighting for the British Empire or against fascism in the Second World War. But in drawing the distinction between what is inevitably the majority identity within the United Kingdom, which is English and British, are the things which are English not British or British not English in terms of identity?
Yeah, of course there are. There are things that are distinctly English in terms of a culture, a way of life, key reference points, symbolism, that are not necessarily about being British, that can go back a long way. Well, I think firstly being part of the English group. I think English is an ethnicity. It is a group that goes back a long way. It's why, as I say, we ask people in census questions around the world whether they are English. Indeed, Americans were confused as to why they were being asked if they were English, because it is a distinctive ethnicity and a group that goes back 1,000, 2,000 years. And it is not simply a state-based identity. So for me, the things that matter are a readily identifiable culture, a sense of a sort of a spirit, a way of life, something that I can look to and identify. And I think, was it Orson Welles who said, everybody can feel Englishness even if they cannot quite put it into words. And I think there is an exercise here that is quite performative in saying, well, what is it that defines X, Y, Z? The clear point, and everybody can pick out different things in their identity, but the clear point to me is there is something different between Englishness and Britishness. And what many people feel is we now have a ruling class that celebrates every ethnicity, culture, and identity around the world, but says to the English, you are not allowed to do the same. And that isn't about race and ethnicity so much in my mind. For some people it will be. It is for race, for being white. It is about a distinctive culture that people feel is being suppressed. And the trends going forward, I think, will exacerbate that feeling. You know, by the end of the century, as I say, I think only our numbers suggest only about a quarter of all people on these islands will be visibly part of that.
Do you think it's possible to define a number? And I shan't ask you what it is, because obviously it would be difficult to pin that down precisely. But do you think it's possible to define a broad number of new people who can arrive in the UK over time, who can, depending on your choice of word, assimilate, integrate, or become fully British if the right policies are followed by the government and by other institutions? In other words, is it possible for people who've come from other cultures and countries to become British if the British state and British institutions do the right thing?
Of course, people can become British. I don't think they can also become English, but that, as I say, it's a different question. Yes, they can become British, but I do not believe that we can integrate and assimilate people to the degree that we need to amid the current policy of mass uncontrolled immigration. I think the two are incompatible. I don't think you can be running an increase in population at, it was around 10% at the moment, while clinging to this fantasy that we can integrate people around a very thin sense of Britishness.
So there are two things there, aren't there? There are numbers, and it's also how thin or thick that sense of Britishness is. How do you think that government or society can thicken, strengthen that sense of Britishness?
One of the challenges we have at the moment is 81% of all people coming into the UK are coming from outside of Europe. Okay, so we are already facing a considerable challenge because many of those people are coming from culturally different, if not, some would argue, incompatible nations. So there are some pretty clear warning signs. 1 million people in the UK do not speak English or cannot speak English very well. We have obvious signs of sectarianism and segregation in many of our communities. And we have a large number of people who openly say, I don't identify as British and I don't identify as English. And the numbers, by the way, are not small. In some areas of the country, it's between 20 and 40%. So we have a lot of people who are openly rejecting that identity. I've been very clear in what I think we need to do. We need to end the experiment with mass uncontrolled immigration because it is an experiment. It's also a very extreme experiment that's only supported by around 10 to 15% of people in this country, most of whom are part of the ruling class and who don't suffer the effects of that policy. But I've also argued for why we need a much more robust, let's say Denmark-style integration strategy, which says at a bare minimum, you have to speak the language, you have to respect our rule of law and the laws of this land. You have to integrate into public institutions. We should not have parallel societies. We should not have parallel legal institutions in this country. I think we will need to go further in doing something like what Denmark has done in while ending mass uncontrolled immigration, actually ensuring that we do not have segregated neighborhoods, that we do not have segregated communities. I was always struck by Ed Hussein's point in his book, Among the Mosques, that if you're a young British Muslim in this country, you can pretty much go your whole day from waking up, going to school, going to mosque, going to local businesses, going to local community groups, and not having any meaningful engagement with a member of the non-Muslim majority. And that always stayed with me because I think for everybody outside of the M25, or indeed in some parts of London, that is immediately obvious that multiculturalism, the state policy of multiculturalism, which has promoted difference over commonality for 30 years, has created the society that we see around us today. And I'm deeply concerned, Michael, about the direction of travel, because one last thing is if we do not get serious about integration in this country, the kind of things we're beginning to see already in British politics with very open signs of sectarianism, the attitudes among certain communities, the fact that anti-Semitism in London has rocketed nearly 300% over the last year, I just think this is the beginning of a much bigger problem in this country if we don't get serious about the demographic trends I'm talking about and come up with a government policy that will actually deal with the underlying issues.
People will know that the phenomenon that you've described, so that in parts of Leicester or Blackburn or Birmingham or indeed London, there will be communities where, exactly as you say, the experience of living, shopping, and so on within a particular community will mean that people will find themselves essentially operating within a parallel society. That absolutely, that is observable. But in order to ensure that that challenge is met, and we take it as read that a future government might well succeed or wish to succeed in dramatically reducing the number of people who come here, are there other steps beyond what one might call procedural, beyond insisting on English in all of government's communications and insisting on respect for the rule of law? Are there other things that one needs to do?
That's a bare minimum, by the way, that I said. We're not even doing the bare minimum.
No, precisely, exactly. And so that's one of the things that interests me, because beyond that, what I infer from what you were saying is that government or others need to be more assertive in certain respects in upholding aspects of British culture. And I was interested in what you think, and inevitably, this is a developing conversation, government should ideally do. To what extent should that reach into everything from the school curriculum or to
Absolutely.
the approach the government takes to, for example, sponsoring culture?
So at broad level, at a basic level, what we need to do is regain control over the borders. My personal view is we need to leave the ECHR, we need to reform the Human Rights Act, and we need to end this open border policy, which is what we currently have in this country. You cannot simultaneously say we need to increase defence spending and defend the British people by running an open border policy, which we know has allowed Iranian terrorists, among others, into the country. Okay, so we need to fix the foundation of the nation state, because at the moment, we do not have a functioning nation state. We then need to do a number of things, as I say, the bare minimum around people have to speak English. They have to participate in the labour market. We have to then, I think, go further in saying we do not want a society with parallel legal systems. We should not have 80 to 85 Sharia courts in this country. We should, I don't think we should be allowing cousin marriage in this country. I think we need to revamp the education system so it is not focused overwhelmingly on teaching children what is wrong with this country, but actually tilts much more towards, a balanced view of our history and our culture. I think we need to be much more assertive in terms of assimilating people who are already here. And there are lots of things that are happening across Europe that we could do here. The Austrians, the Danes, even now the Germans are starting to do many more interesting things around integration than we are doing. In fact, I would argue over the last quarter century, if you go all the way back to Ted Cantle's work in 2001 after the Northern riots, and Ted Cantle said, look, basically, lots of people are living parallel lives. And then Trevor Phillips said, we're sleepwalking to segregation. Then David Cameron said, well, multiculturalism has failed. And on we go. We have, through all of that, nobody has come up with the successor program to multiculturalism, which has failed as a state framework. Nobody has had the courage to say that has failed. We now need to move towards a much more assertive assimilation policy, whereby if you are on these islands, you are part of Britain, you're part of England, there are some non-negotiables, and these would be symbols of that.
You mentioned earlier that there's been a shift in the pattern of migration over the course of the last 15 years and 20 years, and that the significant number of people who arrived on these shores in the first few years of this century came predominantly from Eastern Europe. Now, the majority of people who are coming to the UK are from outside Europe. What some might infer from that is that there are people from some countries and or cultures who will find it easier to assimilate, integrate, and contribute to the UK. And therefore, a migration policy that you would design would say that it was easier to accept people from country A than country B. Is that fair?
I think we should reshape our migration policy around high-skill migration from culturally compatible nations, not low-skill migration from culturally different, if not incompatible nations. As I say, over 80% of migration is now from outside of Europe. Pakistan, Nigeria, China are some of the leading nations, not to mention Eritrea and Afghanistan and the people coming over in the boats. So we have a fundamental problem, which goes back to the Boris Johnson Conservative government, which really completely misread what people in this country want. And it's not actually even about the cultural mix of that migration. It is also about the economic mix. If you look at the number of visas we gave out last year, I think nearly 1 million visas in this country as part of our migration policy, only about 14 to 16% were what we would consider to be high-skilled worker visas. So we are flooding this country with lots of low-skilled, low-wage migrant workers who are taking more out of UK PLC than they're putting in. The OBR and others now concede that point, even though many of us have been making it for years. And on top of that, we are bringing people in from culturally different, if not incompatible nations who are simply going to take longer to adapt and adjust to Western values because of where they're from. And what I read into your question, and I know what you're getting at, yes, I do think all cultures are not equal. And I do think we should be reshaping migration policy around culturally compatible nations and also tailoring our visas around people who are not coming from countries that we know are more prone to crime and criminality. To give one example, we have freedom of information requests from the state, people from Afghanistan, people from Eritrea, 20 times more likely than British nationals to be arrested and convicted of sexual offences and assault in this country. We need to have a conversation about that, like the Americans are having, around who do we actually want in our country.
This may be a hard case, perhaps an unfair one, but you make the point that ideally, people arriving here should be high-skilled and from culturally compatible countries. If it was a choice, Sophie's choice, between a professor of physics from Syria and a 21-year-old Lithuanian lad who was unqualified but clearly capable of strenuous work,
well, we shouldn't have to make that choice to begin with. Boris Johnson was very clear. He talked about the professors coming to Oxford and Cambridge, and that would be the high-skill immigration policy. He talked about the engineers. He talked about the scientists. And what we got were Deliveroo drivers. And that's basically what happened. And it's been a complete car crash. It's undermined prosperity in this country. I would like to see a high-skill migration policy that is tailored to the needs of our country. Now, everyone, liberal progressives will say, well, what about the NHS? What about doctors and so on? Only about 2 or 3% of the number of visas that we've been giving out in recent years have gone to doctors and nurses for the NHS. Social care is a slightly different issue, but the idea that we have got some kind of viable migration policy that is working for this country is for the birds. We don't have that at all.
So the ideal thing would be a point system, not the Australian-style point system, but a point system which allocates some points to some countries on the basis of cultural compatibility and some points to individuals on the basis of high skill.
So my ideal way forward would firstly be an immediate freeze on mass uncontrolled immigration, then to do a lot more work on why we have 10 million people in this country on out-of-work benefits, 1 million young people not in education, employment and training. I want to revamp the economy around those people and give them an incentive to get back into work, not to support this enormous welfare regime, which is undermining our country from within. Then we can get back to the question of, okay, if we have a limited amount of inward migration, let's say 50,000 net migration, something approximate to where we were before the Blairite regime, let's say where we were roughly in 96, 97, but that is exclusively high skill, contributory forms of migration, not what we have at the moment. Because when I look at the current policy mix, we are exacerbating the housing crisis. We are draining the economy. We're draining productivity. GDP per capita is going the wrong way. And we're adding to our cultural problems by bringing a lot of people into the country who don't share our values and, to be frank, don't really like who we are.
You mentioned Afghanistan and Eritrea earlier as countries whose diaspora, for want of a better word, in the UK is more likely statistically to be responsible for a variety of crimes, particularly of a sexual nature. Is there anything you think about Afghanistan, Eritrea, or other cultures, which means that men from those cultures are more likely to commit sexual crimes?
So if you look at the freedom of information requests that have been submitted by people like the Centre for Migration Control, those show consistently foreign nationals are about 3.5 times more likely than Brits to be arrested and convicted of sexual offences, rapes and sexual assaults. We know from the rape gang scandal, there's a very specific problem within Pakistani Muslim communities. And yeah, we know that part of that is wrapped up in an interpretation within some of those communities of the teaching of Islam, but we're not yet ready to have that conversation as a country. But it's very clearly linked. If you read the testimony and the transcripts from the court cases, many of those criminals, I say men, but pedophiles, were clearly using their religion as some kind of proxy or justification for that abuse. Now, I think we need, well, the first point is, why is it taking independent campaigners to get that information from the state, right? So we have Keir Starmer and others saying, well, everybody here is suffering from misinformation while concealing information from the British taxpayer about what is happening in their country. The first thing we need to do, I think, is to have a fully transparent state. Get all of this information out onto the table. Arrest rates, conviction rates, economic information and data by nationality, immigration status. I want to see it all. Let's get all of that information. And then we can make a judgment as to, well, have we got a problem among specific groups? Because it appears currently we do. And I think what you're getting at, and I'll answer your question directly, is yes, we need to dramatically lower, if not stop, migration into the UK from predominantly Islamic nations. That's my view. I think it will support integration in our society over the longer term. If we maintain on the current direction of travel, Michael, it's not just 1 in 4 people in this country will be following Islam by 2100. It's closer to 1 in 3 among the under 40s.
It's perhaps a minor point, but it's certainly the case that Pakistan and Afghanistan are Muslim countries. Eritrea is not. Presumably, one of the things that you would like to do would be to have an examination of cultural factors as well as religious factors that may prevail in other countries that may mean that people, particularly young men from those countries, have a predisposition towards certain types of behaviour.
The first thing I would say is I don't want people entering this country illegally, and I don't think anybody in this country wants those people entering Britain illegally. We've just had some new polling, GB News, 81% of Brits support the deportation of foreign criminals in this country. And I would guess the figure for immediately detaining and deporting people arriving on the boats is somewhat similar given past polling. So nobody wants a status quo. The second thing is we don't even do thorough criminality checks on who is coming into the country, which is completely bonkers to me. Other countries do. We don't do that. We do not look at the extensive criminal history, criminal records of people that we are even given visas to, which is crazy to me. So we need to do that. We need to essentially build a much more transparent interventionist state when it comes to the migration border question that prioritizes the security and safety of British people who in the current regime are really the last to be considered. That's why we're putting these guys in the middle of Britain's communities. I was in Runcorn and Hillsby during the by-election and constantly was outside HMOs, housing for multiple occupancy, with 20 to 30 young men living in a 3-bedroom house from Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, put into the heart of our communities, with taxpayers, law-abiding citizens living in those communities. Those people should be detained and deported on arrival into the UK.
Yes. And again, whatever the we'll come on to Islam in a second. I do want to explore that. And again, whatever the cultural factors, often these will be young men who will have been in war zones and by definition bearing the impact, the trauma of having come from those areas, and therefore the process of integration, come what may, is going to be more difficult. But as well as dealing with the flow, also there's a conversation about some of the people who are currently living in the UK. And not just those who are here illegally, those who are here perhaps on temporary visas, who may go on to apply for indefinite leave to remain and in due course
Well, we should scrap indefinite leave to remain, but that's another question that we can debate.
That is exactly what I was going to. So the Conservatives have, Kemi Badenoch and Chris Philp, have outlined a policy which essentially would mean that some of the people who are currently here, who under past rules would have had a legitimate expectation in their own mind of being able to stay here, permanently in many cases, should be told that's it. So do you think that the number of people who are currently here, we're not talking about the future flow, should be reduced? That there are people who are currently in this country legally who should be told you're not going to have the right to stay, and you should know that.
Yeah, absolutely. So just so people are aware of indefinite leave to remain, because some viewers might not be.
Yes.
If you are here, I think for 10 years, you are allowed to stay essentially forever.
Exactly.
Access social housing, NHS, public services, and bring relatives into the country. Now, Kemi Badenoch and the Conservatives have said that probably should be 5 years. I would go further and say we should have an immediate suspension of indefinite leave to remain until we can get our country back under control. And the reason for that is because if you look at the numbers on what indefinite leave to remain is going to cost British taxpayers, because remember, we're talking about lots of the people who came over during the Boris wave, the post-COVID explosion in low-wage, low-skill migration, which is taking more out of the economy than it's putting in. Well, if you give all of those people indefinite leave to remain, one of the figures that has been suggested by the Centre for Policy Studies, I believe, is somewhere around £230 billion as a cost to the British taxpayer. Now, there's one reason for saying, okay, this is insane. Let's immediately pause indefinite leave to remain. We will review this 10 years, 15 years from now, when we've got the current situation under control. Because at the moment, what we are doing is essentially incentivizing lots of people to come into the country, whether as students, whether as workers, whether as the relatives of workers, to stay, to game the system, and to put those costs onto the hardworking, law-abiding British taxpayer. I don't think that's on. I think we need a much tougher regime. Lots of countries around the world, from United Arab Emirates to Australia, would look at our policy and think this is insane. What you are doing is insane. So I think we need to stop it.
We touched on Islam earlier. There are some people who would draw a distinction between Islam, the faith, and Islamism, the political ideology that seeks to ensure that everyone in the globe essentially should follow Sharia under a universal caliphate and so on. What I inferred again from what you said earlier is that obviously while Islamism is a totalitarian ideology, there is an issue itself with Islam and with the number of people who follow Islam in the UK. Do you want to expand on what you think the particular challenge is as you see it?
So I think we have a number of challenges linked to the spread of Islam, not just in the UK, but across the West. An implicit support for a parallel legal system, which is, in our case, completely alien to our common law tradition. I would like to see a factory reset in this country that takes us back to the pre-Blairite legacy and reestablishes judicial independence and the common law tradition. That's incompatible with Islam. We have a major problem linked to the spread of Islam with free speech and de facto blasphemy laws. And I think we have seen that in a number of cases that I don't need to recite in the UK, but from the Batley school teacher through to the relative silence, actually, over the rape gangs in this country. We do have an issue with free speech, free expression, and individual liberty. And I think we have an issue with women's rights and the rights of women to pursue, let's say, Western liberal ways of life and ideals. I think those things are all true. So we need, I think, to revisit, which is a difficult question for people to think about because, understandably, it's controversial, but we need to revisit ultimately this question: to what extent, if at all, is Islam compatible with Western liberal democracy? And that is a question that is going to hang over British and Western politics for the next 20, 30, 40 years and is going to become more pressing as the demographic changes that I have outlined take place. Just one last point, which is if we are already experiencing what I would say was the bullying of the Michaela School and Catherine Birbalsingh over the desire for Muslim parents to have their children praying in what was otherwise a school that was saying we're not going to have prayer in school, a holy secular school. If we are already experiencing that, if we are already experiencing school teachers in hiding because they were said to have offended local Muslims, if we are experiencing the sectarianism that we see with Muslim politicians in the House of Commons spending more time campaigning for an airport in Pakistan than what is going on in their own seats. And if we are already seeing very troubling survey findings that 40% of British Muslims say they would support a Muslim-only political party, if we are experiencing all of that when the share of our population that is Muslim is 7%, then I would put the question back to you and say, what are we going to experience when it is closer to 21, 22, 23%?
There will be some people, not just within the Muslim community, who would say, yes, there are all sorts of areas of concern that you've understandably highlighted, but there are also British Muslims who have raised similar concerns and who are pious and believing followers of
absolutely,
Islam. So,
absolutely.
Ed Hussein, Taj Hagi, Sadiq Khan,
Zia Yusuf,
Shabana Mahmood, Khalid Mahmood. Do you think it's possible to have a sort of British Islam, as it were? Do you think that it is possible to support an approach which would ensure that you can have even more people in Britain who are pious and believing Muslims and who are also happily integrated into British society in a way which means that you're no more worried about their faith than you would be about someone who was a Zoroastrian or a Presbyterian?
I hope so. I hope so. It is also true from the evidence that second and third generation Muslims within Western societies tend to be more radical in their interpretation of Islam than their parents and their grandparents. So I would like to see, let's say, that strain of British Islam that you point to, moderate, accepting of our culture, ways of life, aware that there cannot be parallel legal systems, aware that there cannot be a dogmatic approach to free speech in the public square. I would like to see that strain become much more vocal than it has currently been in our national life until now. And to me, the rape gang scandal was the really big moment, Michael, because that's a really important opportunity for British Muslims to stand up and say, we are going to call out this behavior very loudly on all media, stand together. Now, my view, and I think the view of many other people, is that opportunity so far has not been taken.
There are some people, including within the Muslim community and outside, who say, well, one of the things about the rape gang scandal is that while so many of the perpetrators were Muslim, a more striking thing is that so many of the perpetrators came from a particular part of South Asia, from Pakistani Kashmir, and that it's more reflective of a particular rural culture with cousin marriage as a feature than it is of Islam overall, and that you don't see this sort of behaviour being carried out by British citizens who come from other parts of the globe who are also Muslim.
Absolutely. Well, we know we have a specific problem with clan-based networks in this country. That is obvious to anybody who has looked at the court cases and the people involved, many of whom are related to one another, and that is why there was silence within Pakistani Muslim communities. It is so. That's why I advocate for things like banning cousin marriage, which I think is now becoming a mainstream policy position. It's in the newspapers fairly regularly. I think that's something we could do to make a tangible difference and begin to say, actually, we have lines in this country that we're not going to cross. And Sharia courts would be another one. We have a legal system in this country. We do not have two legal systems. Just briefly. And the other issue on that, though, is it is also true that the rape gang members and perpetrators were using a particular interpretation of their religion to justify their actions. And that is why it is on all Muslims in Britain to publicly and loudly condemn those rape gangs. Now, go back 10 years, there were lots of people within British Muslim communities. In fact, some members of the current working group on Islamophobia under Keir Starmer and the Labour government I won't mention names, but people who are now currently advising on how we define Islamophobia, who only a few years ago were saying the focus on Pakistani Muslim gangs is itself an example of Islamophobia. Well, I would like to see those people now standing up and saying, we got it wrong. Everybody should be able to talk about this, and British Muslims have a particularly important role to play in saying those people are using our religion, we condemn those people.
Talking of religion and English identity, how important is Christianity to English or British identity, and would you call yourself a Christian?
So Christianity is the foundation of our nation state and our country. It's the Judeo-Christian heritage is visible in pretty much every aspect of our culture and national life, and it is the dominant foundation of our nation state and cultural life, and one that I think we should be doing a lot more to protect and promote. Instinctively, I'm not a practicing Christian, but instinctively, I was raised in the Church of England. I was, like most people on these islands, I went to Sunday school, and I sort of feel that I belong to the Christian tradition. Let's put it that way.
You make the point that so much in this country depends on our Judeo-Christian traditions. Again, it may seem like a minor point, but you drew attention earlier to the existence of parallel societies. And as Ed Hussein has pointed out, and as one can observe, there will be individuals in areas like Birmingham who will potentially go to schools which are Islamic influenced, or where the majority of the children are co-religionists, and then they will shop and socialize with people of the same faith and from the same cultural background. Now, obviously, a long-standing community within the UK is the Orthodox Jewish community, and you can say within the Orthodox Jewish community there will be people who will shop, have commerce, be educated within that community, and tend not to mix. Some would say, well, that's not a problem. These are peaceable folk, and it only adds to the broad richness of British society that we are a safe and warm home for the Orthodox Jewish community. Do you think that there's any sort of tension there between a concern about seclusion within the Orthodox Jewish community and a tendency towards seclusion amongst other communities?
Well, the first thing to say is I spent much of my childhood in Birmingham with my grandparents in a very working class part of Birmingham in Castle Bromwich. And I went back recently and explored Birmingham in some detail, and I've written about it. And I was pretty shocked, actually, by what I saw and what's happened to the city. It doesn't feel to me at all like a united, happy, optimistic, industrious city anymore. It sort of feels like it's become a symbol of the so-called UKification of the UK. And by UK, I mean Y-O-O-K-A-Y, the new symbol of our identity, which is a mishmash of rapid demographic change, migration, and a cultural aesthetic that is fundamentally different from what you and I would associate with Britishness and Englishness. It's an acceptance of decline, but it's also an acceptance of ways of life and values and identities that mark a fundamental break from who we are. It's not a continuation or an evolution. It is an entirely new country in many respects. So I was shocked by that. Now, the issue around British Jews, Orthodox Jews, I would actually disagree with you, and I would say I don't think they feel that this is a comfortable, secure country anymore. I think that we have fundamentally failed to do more to make British Jews feel comfortable and part of the nation, especially since October the 7th. I think we've failed on that front. As I say, anti-Semitism in London over the last year is up 286%, anti-Semitic hate crimes. Of course, we need to work on integration within all communities. I would absolutely agree with that. But I think the fundamental problem in this country coming down the line is not from within British Jewish communities, but is coming from within a particular strain of Islamism, which not only has no desire to integrate, but has an active desire to dominate. And that is the fundamental policy challenge.
And so you would say that if someone from if a young British Muslim were to say, look, in Stamford Hill there are guys who choose not to integrate, and nobody complains about that. You know, they pay their taxes, but
but Michael, I don't
they
see...
choose not to go to British schools. They choose not to. They choose not to go to secular schools. They choose to an extent, set themselves apart from mainstream British society, and that's great for them. Give me the same respect. What would you say to that young British Muslim guy?
I don't see Orthodox Jews running around trying to blow British people up on tubes.
Obviously, we're living at a time when politics is in flux. You have made the point that Brexit, with the benefit of hindsight, was not fulfilled as it might have been, but still a good thing.
Yes.
You didn't vote for Brexit.
I didn't vote on the day, actually.
Do you wish that you had?
Yes.
And when people say, look, you know, the costs to small businesses and the inconvenience and the loss of prestige internationally, all of that means that we should acknowledge it was a mistake. What would you say in a nutshell?
Well, firstly, the reason I didn't vote is because I was running an exit poll. As you know, you see these exit polls on the night of the referendum, and I was in a basement in East London running an exit poll. Yes, I wish I'd voted for Brexit. Brexit to me was not about the economic cost-benefit analysis. We could argue over that. To me, Brexit was about the non-tangible, more instinctive, as Robert Kennedy would say, the non-GDP part of the debate, or as Roger Scruton would say, it was about the heart and soul of who we are. It was about our home. It was about reasserting national representative democracy against an organization, a supranational organization that is not a democracy. The European Union is not a democracy. It was about reasserting our common law tradition, our judicial independence, and it was about reasserting a sense of identity that many people can feel is being diluted and discarded in pursuit of this liberal globalist mishmash of nothing. And so Brexit to me made complete sense on that basis. And on the economy, you know, the most important polling question I thought on Brexit was when people said, look, I will take a short-term economic hit if it means I get the off-ramp. I get to push my country in a different direction. And by the way, when people talk about the economic hit, I don't hear them talking about the 15 billion we're saving every year in no longer paying into the EU budget. I don't hear them saying about the billions we're saving in not having to pay towards COVID recovery loans in the EU. I don't hear them talk about the billions we would now be paying in enlarging the EU to take in the likes of Albania, Bosnia and Serbia. I don't hear them talking about the biggest corruption scandal that the EU has ever had that just erupted in the last few years. And I don't hear them talking about the divisions within the European Union or the fact that it's a declining share of our global economy, down to 13% of global GDP from 20% a decade ago. That I just looked at the EU and I said, look, economically, this isn't working. Politically, this isn't working. But more fundamentally, it's about who we are. And what I saw was an attempt to reassert who we are. And it's somewhat amusing to watch the most diehard Remainers in this country now use the advantages of Brexit to do the trade deal with America, to do the trade deal with India, to impose these lunacy policies like VAT increases on private schools, which they wouldn't have been able to do when they were in the European Union. But we need to make more of it, Michael. We cannot respond to Brexit with this mass uncontrolled immigration, with this economic policy that's given us the highest tax burden since the 1940s and dismal rates of growth, not doing anything about our national debt, not incentivizing businesses to actually become dynamic. And meanwhile, we're chasing anybody who has wealth in this country out of the country. We've got more millionaires leaving this country than any other country. In fact, about 20 times as many as Russia, which is insane. So we've got the post-Brexit analysis fundamentally wrong, even if the Brexit analysis was the right one.
I'm just going to run through a quick checklist of things that should be attractive, I would think, to you in a political leader. So someone who voted for Brexit.
Yes, not essential.
Not
but
essential,
yes.
but a good
Sure.
Someone who called out the rape gang scandal.
Absolutely.
Someone who has been consistently clear that women can't have penises. someone who has always said that we should be more assertive and prouder of British culture and our past, someone who would argue that we should reduce the size of the state and state spending at the moment.
Absolutely.
And also someone who argued that the current stock of people in this country who've come from abroad should be reduced. It's not just enough to reduce future flows, but the number of people in this country should be reduced.
I think you're describing the average voter in this country, not even an ideal leader.
Those are all Kemi Badenoch's positions. Not all of them.
Let me answer that.
Not all of them are Nigel Farage's.
Let me answer that question. Path dependency matters in politics. From where you start will determine your eventual outcome. Here's why I think Kemi Badenoch will not last as leader and the Conservatives will not last. Because from where they have started, particularly with the 2010 to 2024 regime, they have nowhere to go in the public mindset. It has become a deeply toxic, damaged brand, a party that has contributed, I would argue, to the degradation of our home, our country. And I have a lot of time for Kemi, given the things that she has said and the things she's done on particularly woke ideology. But she is operating, and this would apply to Robert Jenrick too, by the way. They are both operating within a structure, within a parliamentary party, within a tradition, liberal conservatism, that is fundamentally adrift from where the new zeitgeist is. And that new zeitgeist is very, very different from the Tory machine and the ideological currents that are underpinning it.
But the people who were associated with liberal conservatism, with Cameroonism, look at me.
I've always found you very reasonable, Michael.
but they're all irrelevant now. They're all past. Kemi and Rob Jenrick were not at the heart of the last Conservative government when many of these mistakes were made. They were only coming to political maturity right at the end. I think, as you've outlined, they are sympathetic to or champions of the positions that you've outlined. And at the same time, they have articulated in different ways with a clarity the need to take these things forward. You've acknowledged yourself, I hope you won't consider this to be a debating point, that you didn't vote for Brexit, but now, as it were, you can see what requires to be done. Isn't it possible that Kemi and Rob Jenrick and others are in a similar position to you? So they could have been more assertive in the past. They have broadly always known what they really believed, and they're now in a position to effect that change.
I think regarding Kemi Badenoch, my question would be, if you believe that, why do you bring back people who oversaw the wholesale liberalisation of our migration policy? If you believe that this is a line in the sand, why are people like Priti Patel still in the shadow cabinet? And the key issue for me is the Conservative Party, philosophically, electorally, politically, is in a cul-de-sac. Even if Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick were able to put their dream team together and try and reshape the Conservative Party, the country itself, I think, has moved on. And to me, the mood in the country is more revolutionary and is almost more focused on the civilizational challenges than Conservatives are willing to accept. For example, I would argue, and I think most people in Reform would argue, we need a full factory reset in this country. It's a bit like a smartphone. It gets overloaded with apps, it becomes slow and inefficient, and it's a major source of stress when your smartphone becomes like that. And you say, God, I hate this thing, it's driving me crazy. You go for the factory reset, and that's what we need in this country. The Conservative Parliamentary Party, dominated as it is by One Nation Liberals, who I would say are indistinguishable from the Liberal Democrats, the Conservative Parliamentary Party is fundamentally incapable of delivering a factory reset in this country. So what those people should do, I would put it to them, all of the people investing all of this energy and intellectual thought and passion into trying to save this dying vessel, this dying creature, they should actually pivot and redirect all of that energy into helping to save this country via the one movement that is capable of bringing about the correction that this country needs. And that's how I view reform. I think it is a correction that the system needs.
Are you a Reform member?
I'm not currently a Reform member.
If Nigel Farage said, Matt, look, you're those articulate advocates of what this movement believes. Come and join us. Stand for Parliament. And more than that, if and when we win, you should be in government. You should be the Reform Secretary of State for Education. Would you say yes?
I think I definitely want to oversee the Home Office.
But you would be happy to serve in a Nigel Farage, Zia Youssef-led Reform government?
100%.
Just finally, just a few sort of personal reflections. You've been an academic. You're now, and I know this is a very un-English phrase, a public intellectual. For you, what have been the sort of formative intellectual influences? You've talked about your family, and that's clearly important. But if people want to understand some of the books you've read, the authors who have had an influence on you, who would you say? So, is it Americans like Christopher Lash? Is it Brits of the pre and post war era like George Orwell? Is it politicians like Keith Joseph or Enoch Powell or who?
How long have you got? Well, don't forget, I spent 20 years in the universities, which was a very strange experience and one we can come back and talk about another time. Lots of people. Christopher Lash, definitely. Eric Kaufman, Roger Scruton, David Goodhart to some extent. So many people over the years who have, in different ways, shaped and contributed to my thinking. I would say for me, there are two things that probably separate me from most of my friends in the Conservative Party. So one is I firmly believe in the principle of popular sovereignty. I believe that power, authority, and legitimacy ultimately lies with the people, not elites. Hence why the likes of Lash, among many others, I definitely have enjoyed reading. And I think the problem we have across the West is too many elites have not realized that power runs vertically from the people to their representatives, not horizontally from one group of elites to another. So even people on the left, people like Peter Mayer and Ruling the Void and the collapse of democratic accountability, lots of those people have been influential. But I also firmly believe in the principle of national preference, that in everything from our economy to housing to border security, ultimately we put the tax-paying, law-abiding, hard-working majority before other people. And so that tradition of national conservatism, which of course has found a lot of expression over the last few years in the United States, Yoram Hazony, among many other people, I think has been also very influential on me. Even some obscure thinkers, Michael Lind in America, who have made this point that the old left-right dichotomy in politics now is redundant. And there is a new politics emerging that is very different from what I would call the uniparty, that is anchored in these principles of saying we're going to reassert the voice of the people, who I think ultimately get things right. We'll never forget, it was the people in this country, when the elite class failed, who got Brexit over the line in 2019. It was the people who said, actually, we're going to reassert our voice and our values. And on all of the issues we've discussed in this conversation, whether you look at immigration, borders, Islamism, multiculturalism, national identity, on all of those issues, it's not 52-48. On all of those issues, if you ask the people, it's 85-15 or it's 80-20. The people are ultimately the ones who are going to save this country. And unleashing popular sovereignty, I think, is going to be absolutely key to that. And putting the hardworking, law-abiding majority first, not about race. It is about, are you supporting this social contract? Are you upholding the rule of law? Are you getting up every morning as part of that alarm clock class and working really hard and actually sharing and protecting this remarkable cultural inheritance that we have so that we can pass that down to our children and grandchildren? So I suppose I'm a Burkean as well in that sense. And I do believe that we have a tradition and a legacy in this country, that goes back generations, and it's up to us now to make sure it's not lost.
Matt Goodwin, thank you very, very much. And we look forward to talking again, I hope.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.